Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you, Prem. I'm going to hand you straight over to Connie Pauchulo from IWRAW, and for her to do some introductions and move us into the next session. Connie, over to you.
Hello, thank you so much, and welcome everyone to the first session called The 4 R's of Tax Justice and the Realization of Rights. I'm delighted to be here with you all and to have the pleasure of moderating a discussion between our 2 distinguished speakers, Liz Nelson, Director of Tax Justice and Human Rights at the Tax Justice Network, and a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity. Liz is an expert in development, human rights, and gender equality, and a leading figure in the tax justice movement. And Professor Philip Alston, Professor of Law at NYU and Chair of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. Philip is an international law scholar and human rights practitioner, having served the UN in multiple capacities since the 1980s. My name is Constanza Pauchulo, and I'm a program officer with the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, an international feminist organization rooted in the Global South and based in Malaysia. This session will introduce the newly launched report by the same name, which is really a call to action around the emergent global movement for tax justice and human rights, and a framework for making connections between the 2 movements through shared opportunities to address, redress, and repair the multiple and intersecting forms of inequality that exist in the world today. We'll start with a presentation of the report by Liz, followed by a response from Philip and discussion questions from me. And then we'll open the floor for a brief Q&A. We do have to end promptly at the top of the hour, so apologies in advance if I'm a tad authoritative in my timekeeping, and thank you for your cooperation. Okay, so with that, I'll hand it over to Liz with a very warm congratulations on the release of the report.
Thank you very much, Connie. So I'll go straight into talking about the report. As Connie said, which we're launching today, Tax Justice, Human Rights, the 4 R's and the Realization of Rights. The report reflects a collaboration of research and advocacy and activism with a number of groups and individuals. And I'd just very briefly like to call out the work and the generous input of the GRADE research team at St Andrews and Leicester University here in the UK, to the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, Tax and Gender Working Group, which Jeannie has introduced and talked about some of their work, and I've worked with them over a number of years, and of course to the tax justice movement and many individuals who've inspired me over the years. So some key points that I wanted to bring out to the report, and I do hope you'll read it and find it, yes, as inspiration and some guidance, and interrogate what we're saying and ask questions of it. So tax justice is a feminist issue. The equalities driven by the tax system failures need a progressive feminist principles approach. They need to be at the core, and an understanding with those principles is of the discrimination which is gendered, intersectional, affects Indigenous groups, and the most marginalized in our societies. A partial approach to policy reform risks replicating injustice and perpetuating those structural inequalities. And the report, in its policy responses, tries to bring out the fact that the point about the partial approach is very little use. And as I say, there's some points that we bring out in that in terms of policy. In the report, we cite the research that TJN produced last year, the State of Tax Justice report, which was using banking data and country-by-country data, identifying 427 billion lost in tax abuse by multinational companies. This is enabled and has been for a long time by professionals accountants, lawyers, as well as governments that fail to establish transparency measures or to undertake assessments of tax policy regime or to reform policies that discriminate against some of their most marginalized people. It is shameful and shocking to record the social and economic rights failures that are a result of still rampant tax abuse. And a range of economic actors are complicit in that, in those failures. The report analyses tax abuse attributable to different countries. It seems, in particular, that the OECD and their dependencies, the OECD countries, and their dependencies are highly complicit in these human rights failures. As a club of rich countries determining global rules on international tax, the OECD have and continue to create with the rich countries the conditions which facilitate the majority of tax abuse. And the report brings out and does an analysis of comparative countries, which, as I say, you can look at. The OECD's assessment of harmful jurisdictions is actually quite limited. And while the OECD countries and their dependencies are responsible for facilitating 68% of observable tax losses through cross-border tax abuse, countries graded harmful by the OECD are just 1%. This means that the tax loss between countries is more or less a one-way flow from global south to global north, from non-OECD countries to OECD jurisdictions, from low-income countries to high-income countries. And we do emphatically draw a link between the human rights failures and on the 4 R's, the revenue, redistribution, repricing, representation, and how nation states don't have the ability to raise that revenue, to redistribute wealth and income, and the rule setting and the policy reforms undertaken within that rich nations, states, and the OECD creates and embeds inequalities even deeper. And we've seen it time and time again, and very recently, only last week, in the latest announcements from the OECD, that the ambition is lacking in attempts to reprogram and reform the global tax rules. A minimum tax rate, for instance, of 15% constricts the poorest countries from taxing multinationals, and effectively, and again, the report brings this out, is denying a kind of statehood, a tax sovereignty, both in the current negotiations and in previous decades. So our report explores human rights perspective and why this imbalance and this negation of proper reform actually matters. The grade modelling work projects that the tax loss that I mentioned of 427 billion projects it over 10 years. And it does so because these effects are not seen immediately. But as a result, it finds that every year, 17 million people could benefit, well, 17 people could benefit from clean water, 34 million people from basic sanitation, if those revenue losses due to global abuse were reversed. Now, these are clean water, health issues, education, are fundamental rights and are essential for survival. Over a 10-year period, these gains would be associated with over 600,000 child deaths and 73,000 maternal deaths. These figures are not insignificant. Were it only one, it would be important, but the scale of it is truly shocking. So the policy reforms need to shift that power. And one of the things I'm going to kind of move on to what those policy reforms need to be. They need to be progressive. They need to provide financial transparency, which should target wealth and income. And existing proposals through the introduction of the OECD BEPS program only offer that partial transparency, and because of that they are essentially flawed. And that has a particularly creates risks for those most marginalized people, especially for women and girls who make up the world's poor, over half of the world's poor. So what are the opportunities, and actually what are the things we can do about it, and what are we advocating in the report? Well, we need to reprogram tax and financial transparency in line with some of the most progressive principles in mind. I haven't actually cited, it is in the report, but I wasn't going to cite the Bogota Declaration, which Jeannie raised up. But I'd also draw you attention to the blueprint, which is the Beijing Platform for Action, and the principles in there for economic justice for women. And I'd also draw your attention to the principles, a new piece of work called the Principles for Human Rights and Fiscal Policy, from a collaboration of different civil society organizations. But what can we do at the moment very specifically? What are those opportunities? Well, the Tax Justice Network and the report itself calls for the design and the implementation of a UN tax convention as recommended by the FACTI panel, and as I say, long advocated by the tax justice movement. This would be an instrument that could reverse international failures of the global tax system and provide an urgent step change needed in the global governance of tax. We need to establish an intergovernmental tax body under the UN auspices to oversee the future negotiations of international rules. And we also need to support that with a mechanism to ensure proper accountability of jurisdictions imposing revenue losses on others through a proposed Centre for Monitoring of Taxing Rights. And finally, there is something again advocated through the tax justice movement and the Tax Justice Network, an ABC of financial transparency, a policy platform which brings transparency on the exchange of financial information, on the beneficial owners of companies, and of the economic activity that is taking place through country-by-country reporting of multinational companies. So I encourage you to read the report. I've skimmed through some of very short details and at a very summary level. I really welcome your comments, and I really welcome any thoughts and interrogation of the figures. Thank you, Connie.
Thank you, Liz, for that excellent overview. And now I will pass it on to Philip for his reflections.
Thanks, Connie, and thanks to Liz. Let me start simply by echoing what other speakers have said in terms of the huge achievements of the Tax Justice Network. I suspect that many of Liz and her colleagues and Prem and others weathered a lot of criticism in the early years of people saying, you've got to be kidding, you can't make a difference. This is too abstruse, too obscure. But the reality is that the mainstream is starting to listen very carefully, I think, to the message that the TJN has long been putting forward. I think this is a wonderful report. I think people really should read it very carefully. The overarching issue, which almost goes without saying, is that tax is central to whatever cause one is working on from a civil society perspective. It's sort of tragic that so many groups, whether they are environmental, social, race-oriented, whatever, tend to think that tax is something that is outside their domain. They have to get on with the main game. But the reality is that no matter how much progress they make in a particular area, it can all be undermined or overturned by changes in the tax system. Liz has rightly said that it is a key feminist issue. And I think that really bears emphasis. I remember after the report that I wrote on the United Kingdom, I was asked at the press conference what the implications of my report on extreme poverty were for women. And quite unscripted and unprepared, I simply responded by saying that I think if a group of misogynists had been sat down in a small room and asked to design a system, particularly a welfare system, that was as bad as possible for women, they probably wouldn't come up with many changes to the existing British system. In other words, it is filled with measures that discriminate very strongly against women, single mothers in particular, but not only. The same, of course, applies to all marginal groups. So if one is working on racism, as I said before, we've seen that there are classic examples in the United States where anti-Black policy is tax policy. That's how it's been achieved in a great many areas in relation to housing and other arrangements. Indigenous peoples. How do we best screw Indigenous peoples? Tax. Extractive industries. You give tax breaks to extractive industries. You penalize those who want to hold on to their lands and not make, quote, the most productive use. Tax is at the heart of it. Migrant workers. Connie will know this well in Malaysia. The best way to screw migrant workers is through the tax system. Many ways of doing it. Liz points to the important role of institutions, the OECD. It's tragic in a way, of course, asking the OECD to identify harmful jurisdictions struck me when she was speaking as like asking an all men's club to identify sexism among members. They're not going to see a lot of it. And the OECD, given its membership, is not going to see a lot of harmful tax practice either. That really does underscore the need to move the locus of the debate elsewhere, and particularly to the UN. I think another issue that comes out, Liz mentioned very effectively the economic, what I think of as the economic and social rights dimensions of tax avoidance and tax evasion. Very direct impact on the ability of governments to provide social services. But we shouldn't neglect the civil and political rights impact of unjust tax systems. They do effectively disenfranchise all sorts of groups. They empower hugely tiny minorities that then end up having greatly disproportionate power within the country, and that comes from the tax system. So civil and political rights are also major victims. Final point I would make is just to warn about the risk of being distracted away from looking at tax issues. And the best example for me is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, where you've got a huge number of civil society groups, all focused admirably and marvelously on SDGs, and very few of them paying any serious attention to the fiscal and financial dimensions. And that's what's undermining the whole of the SDGs. And what we get then is the Secretary General of the UN saying, look, the financing gap is so massive that it can only be filled by corporations, by the private sector, through prioritisation. Imagine if the Secretary General came out and said the financing gap is so great that it can only be filled through tax justice at the international level and domestically, because that's the real answer, and that's what the SDG proponents are not engaging seriously enough with. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Connie.
Thank you both so much. I think there's really so much to pull from both presentations, but we only have about 5 minutes for some follow-up questions so we can then grab some Q&As from the audience. So I think I'll try to limit myself to one question each and ask if you can keep your answers to about 2 minutes, and then hopefully we can grab 1 or 2 from the audience as well. Liz, I'll ask you first, and then you can respond, and then I'll turn over to Philip again. So the first question is actually on the first R, revenue, and a question that we know is often put to tax justice advocates. And I think also touches on Philip's last point about what if tax justice was the answer. So we often hear this question of, if tax rules are reprogrammed to end the kinds of tax losses that you've described, how do we know that the additional revenue will be used to fulfill human rights? What's to stop governments from instead spending money on bigger military budgets and weapons? And as the argument goes, if that's the more likely scenario, is the money not better left in private hands? So Liz, any response to the kind of comment?
Sure, thanks, Connie. Well, I suppose the glib answer is, we can't, you don't know. But I think there are a number of things that we put in place, and I think it's really what the point is the pivotal role of tax, that because it's not just about raising revenue, it's giving people a voice, it's giving them representation. So it also comes back to a more global picture of who sets the rules and where is the balance of power. And if you're looking at one isolated country and saying, well, look, that's a kind of rogue state, or look at they're spending all their money on budgets, on military, the scenario might be such that they're doing it because the rules that are being set don't encourage, don't nurture inequality, they don't shift the power, and so it is people and citizens who will say, we pay our taxes, or we don't want the policies of this country to be like that. But it's a long process, and there has to be a development, if you like, of tax morale, of people engaging in that process. But it's not an easy answer. I mean, I think the other point, which might be a little bit glib as well, is if people don't have if the rules aren't swayed in a progressive way, and power is redistributed and wealth is redistributed, there is no opportunity there. If people haven't got an opportunity, if governments don't have an opportunity, then it's not going to happen. So we have to create the conditions globally.
Thank you so much. And I'll turn now to another question for Philip, but please feel free to also touch on that first one if you have any comments or reflections as well. My question to you though is, we know your work and that of other scholars has very clearly shown that international human rights law does not automatically deliver on the kinds of progressive aims that the tax justice movement is advocating for, and in fact can and has been used to maintain the status quo or even reinforce inequality. So what is needed from the human rights movement to fulfill their side of this new relationship with the tax justice movement? Over to you.
Thanks, Connie. So that's obviously a very important issue. I've long been hammering on, as we would say, about the reluctance of so many in the mainstream human rights movement to tackle either economic, social, and cultural rights, which many of them either think are not really rights or are somebody else's business, and so they don't factor them in effectively, or to tackle the structures which generate the injustices. That's not our role, is the response of those human rights groups. Someone else has to do that. There's been a very big academic debate recently as to whether neoliberalism and human rights are working hand in hand. Variations of it, some saying they are co-conspirators. You know, human rights is designed to promote neoliberalism. Others saying that it's been a sort of passive accomplice, not doing much but facilitating, and others saying that it's just remained silent. The truth is that the human rights movement has not done nearly enough. The reasons partly ideological, in the sense that many in the human rights area don't think that redistribution is a central concern. They do think that if everyone has a vote, everything will then fall into place, and that simply is not true. Often it's professional expertise. I don't understand tax. It's very complicated. I can't be expected to do that. And of course, there are silos where people say, no, I do climate, I do feminism, I do environment, I do torture, and I can't do tax as well. And as I said at the outset, that's very problematic, in fact. I think there are a lot of groups these days, particularly in the Global South, that are seriously trying to come to grips with the broader approach that is absolutely essential. And in some ways, they're leading the way and setting an example for the rest.
Thank you very much. And I hope this conference and the report will also be a step in that direction as well, and getting both sides of the movements to be making the kinds of conversions that the report and both of you have been calling for. So we already have a few questions coming in and we have 6 minutes left. So those of you who would like to add some questions in probably won't be able to get to all of them, but at the very least, at least the speakers will see them. There is a live discussion question at the bottom right of your screen that you can add your questions to the question tab there. And the first one we have is from Dan Kevy and relates to the issue of professional expertise. The question is there a need to add a first E to the 4 R's for education? Tax education is woeful even in the best countries, and per Professor Alston's point, that allows MNEs, multinational enterprises, to keep things vague. So I think that question is for both of you. Liz, do you want to start briefly to respond, and then Philip, you can jump in? Sure,
yeah, it's a great question. I think a number of things I'll say, just 2 or 3 to keep it brief. So I think tax education, there is a kind of literacy issue. I think there's but there's also an investment in keeping things complicated. And I think civil society organizations like Tax Justice Network, and a number of tax justice organizations establishing throughout the world have a real role in unpacking the complexity and actually not letting that complexity divert from what the real human rights issues are. I think it is useful and to be able to take a deep dive, but I think there are also people that we can use and work with to help with that. So yes, it would be good to put an E on that. I think the other point I would just mention as well is one that's kind of worries me for some time, which is how we educate people coming up through MBA programs and a very kind of traditional orthodox way. And I think the curriculum could be very different, particularly in schools. And I think that would be helpful instead of just producing the same kind of orthodox thinking.
I think it's a ridiculous idea, of course, because you'd destroy the acronym. You'd suddenly have I think, Dan points to a very important issue. The question is how we do it, of course. Again, I can't help thinking of analogies, and I don't know what dentists do about trying to encourage people to focus more on dental hygiene, etc. Teeth are a little bit like taxes. We don't sort of want to know about them. It's not very appealing. Tax is so complex, and I think the TJN has done fantastic work, but I think we all need to give more thought to how to educate the general public, which is averse by definition. I don't want to know about taxes. First of all, I don't like them for myself, and secondly, it's all very complicated in these technical terms and so on. And so we have to do even better, I think, in trying to make it an issue of public debate where people feel comfortable talking about it.
Absolutely. Thank you both for those excellent answers. And we're coming up to 2 minutes before we have to wrap up. But there was a comment from Kaval Baradia that links, I think, to Philip's comment on the SDGs and is timely because today was, of course, the first day of the HLPF. And he says that the radicals amongst us view the SDGs as the world's biggest privatization program, a narrative resisted by civil society organizations. So maybe food for thought, maybe something you'd like to comment on, but I will turn it over to you both for some closing remarks. And before I do that, just remind everyone to stay on the platform. The next session will start about 1 minute after we're done. And I think I'll turn it over to Philip first and then Liz to have the closing final word of the session.
Kaval, I think, is wrong in suggesting that his perspective is a radical one. I have no difficulty saying that the SDGs is a giant privatization project, the way in which it is being promoted, and I think that's tragic. One very quick final word. There was a question from Ignacio Saiz about the collaboration between human rights and tax justice groups. And I think there's an awful lot that remains to be done there. His group, the Center for Economic and Social Rights, has been absolutely exemplary, but there are not nearly enough in that category. And I wonder, I don't know if funders ever listen to these sorts of programs, but it would be very good because at present all the incentives are there for groups to do their own thing individually. And I wonder if a funder would contemplate some sort of consortium which would actually provide a financial and other incentive for different groups to work together, whether it's climate change, whether it's gender equality, and so on with the Tax Justice Network, for example, to really get a coordinated approach. Thanks again, Connie and Liz.
Hi, thank you. Yes, well, I absolutely agree with that last point, Philip. I mean, I do think that those who want to see a change, we need to really step back and not think in our silos. You know, to the point made by Ignacio, I think progress has been and is slow, but if we're going to change, we need to be strategic and unselfish, and thinking about what are funders thinking in terms of change, and how can they help strategic thinking rather than this particular narrow area of work. So it's been a great session. I've been really honoured to have both Connie and Philip thinking and talking with me about the report. I just say I really hope that you do read it. You look at the recommendations, you act on the recommendations. I can't recommend more to you the principles for human rights in fiscal justice. It's a fantastic piece of work, and I think really shows the value of collaboration. So thank you all very much. Back to you, Connie.
Just a warm thank you as well to both you, Liz, and Philip for the fantastic discussion. And thank you to everyone who joined. A pleasure being here with you all. Enjoy the rest of the conference and read the report.